All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Sophie Lavoie, and I'm the organizer for the Feminist Lunch Series here at UNB, which we've been doing virtually this year, and I'm glad that you're joining us today. Hopefully you've attended some of our other events. I'll be announcing at our next event that our talks are going to be available to the public on the University Women's Center website. So I'll be sharing that link with through our regular networks when I get a chance. I'm really happy to welcome today Angela Tozer. But before we do that, I just want to do a traditional land acknowledgement. So from the territory we're broadcasting today, we respectfully acknowledge that our institution stands on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional Wolastoqey land. The lands of the Wabanaki people are recognized in a series of peace and friendship treaties to establish an ongoing relationship of peace, friendship, and mutual respect between the equal nations. And we encourage participants to consider how they respect that relationship every day. So, as I said, our talk today is by Angela Tozer. Angela researches Canadian history with a focus on the 19th century and explores the relationship between capitalism, settler-colonialism, and works a little bit of archival and oral history, as we're going to see, especially in Indigenous communities. So this project is examining Canadian public debt, which facilitated the settler-colonial expansion over all of our Indigenous territories. And that's going to be the subject of her talk today, which is gender, race, and settler colonialism in the financialization of the Canadian state credit public debt from 1820 to 1880. Welcome, Angela, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Lavoie, for inviting me here today, and everyone who's joining us as well. I'm going to share my screen here with everyone. Will it work? Can everyone see that?
Just a second.
The screen?
Not yet.
Is it?
Maybe. Is your video on?
Yes.
Okay.
Should I turn it off? Does that work?
I'm not seeing your video either, so let me see.
Okay. Can anybody else see the screen? Because
I can see it now. I just want to check that everybody else can see it.
They should be able to. But, yeah.
Okay, people are saying that they can't see the screen. Thank you for your patience.
They can. Okay, great. How is my volume? It's a little echoey in here, so I'll try to speak closer to the microphone if that helps.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I just want to thank again to Dr. Lavoie for inviting me here today, and for everyone to coming and joining us during their lunch break, hopefully what is during your lunch break. So I think one story that might be familiar to many Canadians, told many times about Canada, is depicted in this image here. Hopefully you can see it in the screen share, where you have immigrants expanding west, usually first British immigrants, and then expanding to Eastern European immigration in the later 19th century, early 20th century. And the narrative usually they're coming here for a better life. You see the railway aiding development, building roads, eventually industrializing. Progress, so to speak, progress. So this image is from a promotional brochure by the Canadian Pacific Railway, praising the Canadian prairies as around 1910. And I think it captures this narrative perfectly, right? This kind of very romanticized ideal of settler expansion. But a question I want to address today is, where did the money come from to build a railway, to pay for immigrants, their tools, to pay for companies, to develop things, to facilitate transportation and trade, such as canals? As early 19th century British observers frequently pointed out, the British North American colonies that would eventually join together to become Canada were both too capital and labor poor to build anything of significance, such as canals for transportation. And I want to suggest the questions of how development was paid for and this influx of British settlers from the 1830s onwards were intimately linked together. So how is Canada financed? And what does answering this question tell us about Canadian politics, economics, society, and culture? And I'm going to suggest here this question, how was Canada financed, reveals how the foundational structures of Canada were and deeply are still gendered and racialized. This development and progress, in quotations of course, was financed through an increasingly global system of credit and debt, facilitated by financial institutions such as the London Stock Exchange that formalized in 1801, and allowed for the trading of globalizing securities. And it was the public debt that funneled capital into settler colonies, such as those that became Canada, to primarily pay for development and to support British settlers. But much like today, if you were to borrow money from a bank as an individual, you would need to assure the bank that you could pay back both the original principal amount plus the interest. And you had to be determined to be creditworthy, that you were able to pay it back. So what made the British North American colonies and then Canada creditworthy? If they were both capital and labor poor, if they needed to borrow money in the first place to even spur development and emigration, what gave Canada its credit? And in order to secure such unprecedented long-term and low-interest loans that were issued as securities on the London Stock Exchange, again traded globally, creditors assumed the settler colonial governments had, quote, possession of Indigenous living spaces. The land, waters, and all the resources, they argued, could be developed and produce a revenue through real estate or mining or building canals. In the future, this logic went, once the British settlers came over and capital was injected into development projects, land value would rise, the development projects would produce a revenue, and therefore both principal and interest of the loan could be paid. Therefore, credit was not based on the current value of Indigenous living spaces, but a calculation of the future value. Because the principal and interest had to be paid back, this encoded an expansionary mechanism into the structures of settler colonialism. And the London Stock Exchange allowed for trading of public debts as securities, and this quickly turned into a new speculative frontier, so to speak. In the early 19th century, the case of the emerging independent Latin American countries, this speculative debt bubble eventually popped in the 1820s. At the same time, the relationship between speculation and market value, that is, assumptions about future value, or speculating on the future of a government seen through public debt financing, gave land its market value in the settler colonies. And this is evident in the example of the British North American colonies that would become Canada. All of this, despite the existence of nation-to-nations treaties that rendered Indigenous living spaces, for example, Apaquid, the British named Prince Edward Island, unceded and unsurrendered. Despite this, Indigenous living spaces still gave the British North American colonies and then Canada their credit. Oops, move that out of the way. So in order to develop the labor and capital poor settler colonies, prominent British political economists at the time, such as John Stuart Mill and what was known as the colonial reform movement, devised a way to get capital and labor into the British settler colonies. And here's Edward Gibbon Wakefield, seen here with this little label at the bottom of his picture saying founder of New Zealand, which he'd like to present himself as. He wasn't, of course. But his involvement in the colonial reform movement centered on lobbying for the British government to pass imperial legislation to push British immigrants out to settler colonies to develop the colonies, and to get the settler colony to take out a public loan to pay for both emigration and development. And this was argued on the basis of 19th century political economic logic that wanted to expand British capital investment, and the settler colonies became one place of capital investment. Wakefield argued that a land fund, that is money the colonial government made from selling and renting unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous living spaces, could pay for emigration. However, before a land sales fund could be established to allegedly pay for emigration and land development, an initial sum of money would have to pay for the first settlers. And this initial development, and here colonial reformers proposed the settler colony take out a public debt. And the 1834 South Australia Act implemented these principles in imperial legislation. And you can see this logic here when Wakefield said, by empowering the commissioners who were charged with other parts of the operation to raise money for the purpose of emigration upon the security for each colony of the lands to be afterwards sold in that colony, and binding them, of course, to apply the sum which they raised by anticipation for each colony in conveying immigrants to that colony and to no other. Unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous living spaces were the security. The settler-colonial colony raised a loan as their public debt and paid for British emigrants because the loan was secured by these Indigenous living spaces. And these settler-colonial government debts began being listed as securities on the London Stock Exchange in the 1830s and increased in number until they became their own discrete sector of investment in the latter half of the 19th century. So these two images here, I'll try to move my cursor out of the way because I hate it when cursor's on the middle of the screen. So these two images here are from a securities listing for the London Stock Exchange called The Course of the Exchange. These are broadsheets and newspapers, gave investors information about security trading, much like we have today in Financial Times and things like this. So the circulation of a bi-weekly printing of securities listing and their prices provided information for such investors. And this definitive securities list had roots in a pre-formalized stock exchange at Jonathan's Coffee House, where the stock exchange kind of began, where in London, that is, where Jonathan Castings issued his first Course of the Exchange and other things all the way back in 1697. And the original stock exchange, this pre-formalized stock exchange before they got together as proprietors in 1801, met at Jonathan's Coffee House and then later at the larger location of Garraway's Coffee House. So throughout the 19th century, this Course of the Exchange financial securities listing was always printed on one double-sided sheet of paper. And this may have to do with the convenience of circulating one page only and the cost of the stamp, which is a tax, since it was printed every Tuesday and Friday. So when the number of securities available for investment began to increase exponentially, especially after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the convention of printing a single sheet of paper for the Course of the Exchange continued. The papers, however, began to increase dramatically in size. And by the 1880s, the broadsheets for the course grew in size to this, to a large newspaper in size, which is why it's difficult to capture here in an image. But you can see here the colonial government securities. So this is on the front page, which suggests that this sector of investment was extremely important. And it wasn't until the 1850s that the colonial government securities even had their own listing. And on this side of the page, it's more of a close-up of this from a different year. And you can see all of the colonial government securities, which always meant settler colonies. And you see British Columbia, the Canadian government, Cape of Good Hope. Now you might see Mauritius and Natal, as well as Ceylon is there as well. Yeah, right there. So, Mauritius and Ceylon is Sri Lanka now, were not anomalies, but they were kind of maybe more as failed settler colonies. So they're these tropical settler colonial projects in the British Empire where there were settlement schemes to kind of make little pockets of Britain in quote unquote tropical places, such as Udagamandalum in the Nilgiri Hills, which was a very popular British hill station in Tamil Nadu in India. So the listing under colonial government securities did not exist until the 1850s, and the first settler colonial public debt was the Upper Canadian Debt in 1837, which was listed under a miscellaneous section at the very back and end of the Course of the Exchange, suggesting that it was not very important. So investing in settler colonial public debts grew in importance as they started to appear on the front page of the paper and expanded, and they also tracked the emergence of settler colonies as independent settler nations. The investment into these settler colonial government debts was both deeply racialized as well and gendered as well, I'll get to in a second, with Wakefield's ideas about how this emigration scheme would work. It was just assumed the British settler government had the right to appropriate Indigenous living spaces for settler credit and to grow the public debt, to have a bigger loan. Wakefield argued that, quote, this land is held by the government as a trustee for the people, and he characterized the settler colonial process itself as actually democratic and for the, quote, people. He then continued to say, quote, extinction of native title was the indispensable first step in the work of laying open land for appropriation and use by the industrious settlers, end quote. The people technically could include Indigenous peoples, and it actually did include Indigenous peoples, as was the case with Lower Canada's 1838 Declaration of Independence. Importantly, however, the people never included Indigenous peoples' sovereignty over their own lives and living spaces. The government reserved that right for itself. And by the mid-19th century, colonial reformers and settler-colonial governments alike saw the advantages of taking out a public debt to both intentionally raise the market value of land in the settler colonies, which had little to no market value. So once land was developed, it would increase in value to fund British settlers emigrating to the colonies. So that's the gist of the scheme. So furthermore, British society valued land as private property. And private property made land, quote, real, which gave it a market value. And even then, however, this asset was not liquid. Land as illiquid value meant that it could not be traded as securities or moved around a market. Like you can't just get rid of it easily, right? So in order to free land from its low value and illiquid status, there needed to be a way to trade it on the London money markets. And this was the innovative crux of Wakefield's theories and John Stuart Mill's theories as well. Arguably, the public debt became the tool that transformed land into this liquid asset. And debentures and bonds literally made the illiquid asset liquid. And here's an image of a late 19th century PEI debenture, where the credit from Indigenous living spaces imbued these debentures with speculative value of that kind of future value. And the mobility of the debenture allowed them to circulate freely through the London money markets. And the public debt literally transferred the wealth from Indigenous living spaces into the hands of global financiers, at this time centered in London. So just a few examples to look at how explicitly leveraging Indigenous living spaces for public debt was, or how settler-colonial creditworthiness came from the racialized assumption that the settler government could appropriate Indigenous living spaces, that they had the right to. So here, the first one we have William H. Whitmore, who is a political economist, says immigrants to settler colonies funded by a loan chargeable on the future proceeds of land sales in the colony to secure money in the money market. Charles Poulay Thompson, Lord Sydenham, says the Upper Canadian Legislature should resolve the question of clergy reserves as a sine qua non to the promise of a loan. And this had to do with Upper Canada's terrible economic state before it joined with Lower Canada in the 1840s, and asking for an imperial loan guarantee. The General Assembly of Prince Edward Island says the security of monies borrowed, monies arising from the sale, rents, and profits of lands purchased thereunder and paid into the treasury, shall in the first instances be pledged and rendered liable for a public debt. So this is when they're proposing what was called the Land Purchase Act in 1853, where they took out a public debt to buy lands. So underlying the loan, this public debt and the loan, were questions about who can keep a promise, who can understand British property and contract law. And these ideas were deeply gendered and racialized and pivoted on this binary logic of rational, irrational, and especially for political economists such as John Stuart Mill, civilized and uncivilized. And British women and Indigenous peoples in the settler colonies lacked the reason to enter into this debt contract to borrow money in most cases. A settler government composed of elite British men could be trusted to borrow, and it was not a coincidence that responsible government was directly related to who exactly was allowed to be in government and the creditworthiness of the settler government. And these ideas about who could have credit, who could be trusted and relied on, also were deeply gendered notions about this kind of rational trustworthiness. So for example, even back in the 18th century, Daniel Defoe wrote about the irrationality of a character that he called Lady Credit, with deeply gendered ideas that rational men could kind of court Lady Credit with their rationality, and this rationality of men was also moralized as well. And historian Margaret Finn put it, 19th century English novelists were obsessed with debt and credit. And it wasn't just lenders, brokers, and people in financial institutions thinking about credit and debt with, mathematical equations and things like this. It permeated culture, and it had an underlying moral code to it as well. So these ideas about debt and rationality, contract law, and property law can be seen in John Stuart Mill's understanding of the public debt, or more precisely, British contract law as civilized and rational. So John Stuart Mill greatly supported Edward Gibbon Wakefield and the colonial reform movement, and he made this clear in his criticisms about the American government after the American Civil War in the 1860s. And this example shows the gendered and racialized logic behind this kind of system of credit and debt, which is based on cultural ideas. So after the Civil War, the American government debt had become controversial because of the monetary and banking policies during the Civil War, which I won't go into here. But at the same time, this war increased the national debt from $65 million to $2.7 billion. And the American government issued non-specie-backed greenbacks during the war, in part to fund its expenditures, so printing money not backed by gold. And they also instituted a complex national banking system that created a myriad of issues, making the system vulnerable to financial panics. So after the war, the United States wanted to resume specie payment of paper money, and this meant that the government needed to reduce the number of greenbacks to increase their value, as the post-war worth stood about $35 to $100 of gold, so they really had to reduce the value by increase the value by reducing the number of greenbacks. So the American policy of currency contraction that reduced the amount of greenbacks and their move to return to the gold standard raised serious questions for British investors who were holding the majority of American bonds. So legally, the interest of the national debt had to be paid in gold, not paper money, although it was unclear if the principal had to be paid in gold as well. The hard money or bullionist perspective in the United States argued that against the greenbacks or soft money side, who insisted paper money could pay back the national debt, both the principal and interest. So John Stuart Mill disagreed with the proponents of soft money, and he argued that the United States needed to pay the debt in gold, and he pointed out the moral obligations about holding to the terms of the debt contract. Mill's ideas provided many insights about how those who approved of the national debt for financing the government expenditure still tread on this morally murky water. He called changes to some Americans wanted some Americans wanted to the parameters of the debt payments, quote, one of the heaviest blows that could be given to the reputation of popular governments and to the morality and civilization of the human race. And this condemnation came because some Americans wanted to essentially change the terms of this debt contract. The familiar civilized, uncivilized tropes informed Mill's ideas about responsibility of the people to the government and the government to the people. And the idea that this was deeply based in ideas about fulfilling contract law. So settler-colonial credit relied on a direct relationship to the rational market actor, a gentleman who could fulfill his debt contracts, almost always a he. And settler credit also relied on a close association with the British Empire, hence the necessity of British settlers to emigrate so that settler self-governance could be achieved by the settler colony. So how exactly did this work in Canada? And I'm going to give the example of Epiquet, the British named Prince Edward Island here, to understand how speculation in a way is built on a system of trust. And that trust comes from a worldview that understands specific people to act rationally, that is, these elite British men such as John Stuart Mill, but also on assumptions about who has ownership rights. And here ownership is only to be described under the British property and contract law, completely excluding Indigenous methods of governance, such as treaty relationships. So this is the classic image of the Fathers of Confederation at Fanning Bank in the Lieutenant Governor's House in Charlottetown, which was taken during the Charlottetown Conference in September 1864. So the Confederation of Canada in no small way was related to extending its credit. And again, this was quite explicit that joining Confederation would extend each province's credit, and many provinces were deep in debt. The joining together of British North American colonies always had this kind of debt relief, extension of credit aspect to it. So for example, in 1841, when Upper and Lower Canada merged, explicitly this was done as debt relief for Upper Canada that was in near bankruptcy. And it allowed it to extend its credit by joining with the Lower Canada trade on the St. Lawrence Canal. And Section 111 of the 1867 British North America Act, or the Constitution, stipulated that, quote, Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the Union. And Sections 112 to 116 made those provinces owe that debt to the Canadian government at an interest, and the Canadian government in turn owed the entire combined debt to debt holders. The Canadian Constitution allowed for a consolidation of debts into the Dominion debt and an extension of settler credit. Here now settler state credit. But also think about this image as the people who were trusted to take out a loan. This was who big London banks such as the Barings Bank understood to be creditworthy. And this was based on, again, assumed ownership of Indigenous living spaces, rationality, and the ability to understand British contract and private property law. The example of the island government's failed attempts to have their public debt issued as securities on the London Stock Exchange also highlights this point. The Prince Edward Island government's fight to have their debt issued as securities is a great example of how this extension of public debt state credit worked, and how explicitly settler credit was tied to ideas about the settler government's ability to appropriate Indigenous living spaces and its closeness to British governance in the British Empire. And it also makes a great example too, because the peace and friendship treaties of the 18th century make it clear that the land and waters still are unceded and unsurrendered. So the island government did not have credit derived from appropriating Indigenous living spaces as other British North American colonies did, not because of the treaties that never ceded nor surrendered the island, but because Mi'kmaq living spaces on Epiquet were made British private property in 1767. After the 7 Years' War in 1767, the British government divided the island into 67 20,000-acre lots and gave them away in a lottery in London, effectively making the island private property protected by British property law. It also created a situation where the island government did not own the land in fee simple title or private property, so it cannot borrow against these lands because now they belonged to the British landowners according to British property law. Unlike in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or British Columbia, the island government did not own the lands. And furthermore, they could not appropriate the lands in the same way, for example, the province of Canada appropriated lands from Indigenous peoples and nations, because they could not appropriate lands from British landlords because British landlords had their rights protected by the imperial government, who blocked the island government from even taxing them. So this created a situation where the PEI government had nothing to use to leverage or secure a loan because they did not hold the majority of lands according to British private property law. And the island government could not generate speculation about the future value of lands to get a loan issued as securities on the London Stock Exchange until it joined Confederation and until the railway offered it a path to speculating on the future market value of the island. So it wasn't until the island joined Confederation in 1873 that they were able to get a loan issued on the London Stock Exchange. So in June of 1873, right after it joined Confederation, the private bank in London, Morton, Rose & Co., or the Bartholomew House, financed the island government's public debt. And the island government had its debt issued on securities on the London Stock Exchange. The Stock Exchange issued these bonds because they had the, quote, security of the whole Dominion. So once the island joined Confederation, it had its bad credit extended. Also, Canada bought out those landlords and proprietors. So now the island owned the land. So the loan amount amounted to £220,000 sterling at 6% interest, which was a very large amount at the time. And Bartholomew House financed other railway ventures as well, notably Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railway Company gave $1.5 million to them. So in September, this is an image here from September 1969, the royal visit of Prince Arthur, the Prince of Wales, to Prince Edward Island. And you can see here the sign, loyalty to the sovereign. So it was really who was deemed creditworthy was based on British cultural assumptions about gender and race. And in the case of Canada, a British settler government who could appropriate Indigenous living spaces was deemed creditworthy. It also had to do with what types of people were running the government. So in a settler government and during responsible government, there was this really close association and loyalty to the British Empire. So the proximity to the British Empire also extended its credit as well. So the way the deep structures of settler colonies are gendered and racialized, particularly pertaining to the capitalist system of credit and debt, which is a power relationship, so creditor nations having power over debtor nations, for example, is a new and kind of exciting field of study. For example, Dustin Jenkins has this new book, The Bonds of Inequality, and he says it asks who or what was deemed worthy of debt. It shows how the infrastructural investment in whiteness made for illicit advantages for working middle and upper class white Americans. That's what his book looks at. So debt and the understanding of credit worthiness was hardly a neutral calculation of someone's assets. Debt and creditworthiness was based on assumptions of who had reason, who was civilized, who owned the land. And in the case of settler colonialism, this meant a British-oriented settler government that had responsible government. So, and settler credit derived from an assumed ability to appropriate Indigenous living spaces, which was a deeply racialized assumption as well. Okay, thank you everyone. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. I jumped a little bit ahead because I was afraid I was running out of time. So
no worries at all. Thank you so much, Angela. That's fascinating. I'm teaching the feminist theory class this year, and we just had a discussion of decolonization, and I think your work is so important for kind of explaining that historical background of how settler colonialism works and why the land was appropriated from the Indigenous people despite the peace and friendship treaties, especially in our region. So I'm really impressed by this work, and I think it has a lot of value for those of us who are teaching in this area for sure. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm sure you have lots to ask, so I'm looking at see if there's any hands raised, or if you'd like to speak up, you're welcome to speak up. Just looking, everybody's being shy, Angela. So Heather's got her hand up. Go ahead, Heather.
Hi, Angela. Really,
hi.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I actually, like Sophie, I'm just teaching the Indian Act this week in my class, and so much of so what I would love to hear your thoughts are about, because you know the sort of the narrative, the RCAP narrative around, you know, the 1800s, we see this sort of doctrine of assimilation. Curious about how you think about because I think what I'm understanding your work is that they're not, you know, often there's that sort of, okay, well, we, you know, immigration increases, but really what I hear you saying is that it's the debt that's driving, or the desire for credit that is driving the immigration, which is also then driving future settler colonial dispossession of land or displacement. And I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts about how that relates to the shift in the federal government with regards to the negotiation of the numbered treaties, and then some of the land private property tenure elements of the Indian Act.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. That's a lot of, hopefully I can answer most of the aspects of that question. So with respect, what's interesting is, so the first of these public debts are, and I'm talking about all settler colonies and actually the world. So Britain has its public debt in the 1690s, and that's kind of an anomaly, but it's not really until the London Stock Exchange formalizes, you get all of these other public debts. And the first two are the French public debt, which is listed because after the Napoleonic Wars, the Treaty of Paris had them pay this massive war indemnity. And the only way they could do that is taking out a public debt. And actually, proprietors of the London Stock Exchange, such as David Ricardo, made a ton of money off of this. And so it really is something that begins in a very definite historical period. It's not something that existed since time immemorial. Of course, governments had a debt prior to this, like monarchs, but they were like very high interest, like some cases 50% interest, and you would have to pay it back within a year. But what you see happening here with the financing of these colonies is that the debt just gets rolled over and over. So to the point where it never gets paid off. So the initial public debts in Upper Canada in the 1820s that actually very explicitly were raised to give to the Welland Canal Company to develop the canal, in a very, like, they literally had it like an acts of legislation that said an act to raise loan for the Welland Canal Company, right? So they were giving it to the canal company. And this is pretty normal at that time, raising a public debt to give to private companies, and in some ways still happening now with the oil and things like this. So that just rolls over the debt. So they just keep passing legislation. And now we still have our same debt now. So this is something very new with how these governments are being financed. And it's very much deeply associated with the independence of that nation as well. And also the idea that this colonial reform movement and other reformers, like, this was a very intentional move to get British settlers to come to the settler colonies to develop it, for the explicit purpose to give land value so that they could purchase land and sell land and things like this, because land had a very low market value in the settler colonies, like in the 1800s. So this was a problem that they were trying to solve. Now, because they were, when the Canadian government comes about and they consolidate all the provincial debts that join the New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the province of Canada, and then later PEI, British Columbia, they also purchased Rupert's Land. So that's like the land in the middle that's mostly the numbered treaties that the numbered treaties are based on, also buy a debt, right? So the Canadian government, and what makes it special is also this association to Britain and its credit being associated with these other white nations, like the settler nations, in a way that an independent nation such as Haiti, which is, doesn't have and is explicitly being blocked from doing. So it's very deeply racialized as well in this way. And not only that, but the assumption there, as I said in the talk, of Indigenous people's lands, just, it's not like they were going in and they were doing this, like putting settlers in spaces to physically appropriate land. But when you make a contract and say, I'm going to borrow £1 million sterling, and I don't have any money to do that now, but 20 years from now I can pay that off because guess what, we're going to build a canal. It forces you to build that canal and constantly going into the future to pay back that debt and the principal plus the interest, which was probably the worst part. It was very expensive, right, at 5 or 6% interest. So it kind of created this like expansion, right, mechanism that you still see in the the state, like how the state is done with things like the pipeline. How that's related to the Indian Act, which is basically trying to get rid of treaties, right, and to get rid of status. I mean, the Indian Act is, a double-edged sword in that it is kind of holding up the Canadian government by its own jurisprudence to recognize treaties of Indigenous peoples, but at the same time, it's a racialized law. It gives people legal status based on their race, like their, and then of course the gender discrimination in the Indian Act as well. But these are all kind of parts of the same mechanism, which is why you can't really see Canadian history as like, oh, this is economic history. This is its public debt. It's divorced from this. It's all a part of the same thing, which is trying to appropriate these living spaces to expand in a way. If that answers your question at all. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent answer, Angela. We've got Michael with his hands up. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, Dr. Tozer. Thank you very much for this talk.
Hi, Michael.
I really enjoyed it. And I have so many questions, but some of the things you said about Wakefield really got me thinking. And some of my research looks at Wilmot Horton, who comes before him. And I was kind of curious what the relationship is, because I know with Horton, he proposes that the parishes with, through their poor tax be the mortgage of which, emigration will be sent over. And this change to land is so interesting to me. And I was wondering how that sort of fits in the story, or how that might not fit into your story that you're trying to tell.
That's a great question. And it really does fit in the story. So Edward Gibbon Wakefield absolutely hates Wilmot Horton. He calls him like a pretender in political economy. And, Wakefield is you try not to judge people when you're a historian, but he is a terrible person. Like, he kidnapped 2 underage girls, which he went to jail for, to force them to marry him And he was basically a pariah. So he's like, when he wrote his like treatise on settler-colonialism, he's writing from jail because he kidnapped this 15-year-old girl. Anyways, so he was very vocal about people he didn't like, and Wilmot Horton was one of them. So this is a great question to kind of explain why it wasn't this kind of accident that British settlers came over here, because there were all these in the 1810s, 1820s, all these other types of schemes to kind of, the concern is that after the Napoleonic Wars, there's too many British people. There's this idea in political economy that the laboring class is being pauperized, as they say. So they couldn't understand unemployment in the same way we would understand employment now. So the way that they said it was because there was overpopulation, and this had to do with Thomas Malthus and all the rest of it. So the idea that Horton had was to take people out, paid for by the parish, actually mortgaged by the British government in a kind of a mortgage relationship, and send them to the colonies, which was extremely expensive. Like, it's super expensive to send people over here, and people don't want to go. Like, if you read settler letters back home, the people don't want to leave their family, right? For the most part. There's, of course, few people who do. So Wilmot Horton's plan still relied on the British government to finance that. And the kind of genius, if you want to put it that way, of Wakefield's plan was that the taking out of public debt creates an independent, discrete economy of that settler colony away from Britain's economy. So your public debt is now financing Canada, and it's not Britain paying for you, right? So it was a way to distance Britain's financial responsibility to the settler colonies, which of course they wanted, because after the Napoleonic Wars, it was, dire straits economically there. So this is a really great question, because there were other types of settlement schemes that just didn't work because they were very expensive for a lot of reasons. And political economists, including John Stuart Mill's own father, James Mill, was very against settler out-migration because they saw it as like a drain to the wealth of Britain, to use that kind of Indian nationalist term, the drain of wealth. So they saw it as this drain. But Wakefield has this, I don't want to get into too deep into 19th century political economic theory to bore everybody, but he has this theory that it's called the expansion of the field of employment for capital. So this idea that people in Britain have a lot of money, but they were just putting it in savings banks. So how do you get those people to invest, to kind of grow? Because they had this idea that without investing, the economy is going to stagnate, right? So how do we push our investment elsewhere? So they say this kind of employment of the field of capital, to expand that field of capital, to invest in a safe bet, the other white states, right? The settler colonies. So it all is kind of connected together, but there's definitely a huge rift between Wilmot Horton and Wakefield. But of course, Wakefield's ideas get picked up because they work, because and they relieve Britain of any financial responsibility. So.
All right, thanks for your question, Michael. Any other questions or comments for Angela? Please feel free to raise your hand or just speak up.
Hi, I can't raise my hand. I keep clicking on the button, but it says you can't raise your hand. Try again. But
No problem.
I was wondering if I could ask a quick question.
Please do so.
Sure. This is Rob Burrows. I'm a PhD student at UNB. I'm studying the Crown, for the modern Crown and its representatives and their role in reconciliation. So I do a bit of work with Heather as well. And I'm just, one of the pieces of research that I was working on this past spring was on the kind of the advent of New Brunswick and the Crown shenanigans around there. And I was wondering where this kind of the creation of this province within a province might feature into some of your research on the debt, and kind of what the debt is in that story. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, so New Brunswick actually is right after Upper Canada in 1837 has its debt issued on the London Stock Exchange. So the reason why I keep saying debt issued on the London Stock Exchange, it's because it means the stock exchange proprietors kind of believe in your this investment, and it gives you access to all sorts of investors, like global financiers basically, but mostly they're set in London. They live in London. So New Brunswick early on has its debt lake, which was an anomaly considering the other provinces as well. And one of the reasons for that is because of the intense resource extraction, right? I mean, there's always the and to me, what's interesting is how these kind of structures that were laid down in the 30s and 40s and 50s are kind of echoes of what is even happening today. So you have this like more debt that's the credit where that's centered on resource extraction in a very direct way. That it wasn't necessarily in places like Upper Canada in the 1820s, 1830s, that's focusing on like development and railway and things like this as well, if that answers your question.
And I was wondering if, so when New Brunswick had, and I think this predates 1837 if I remember my dates correctly, when New Brunswick had its own version of the Indian Act, which basically legalized for the colonial government, like, hi, we're just going to appropriate India or Indigenous lands when and how we want. Was that a fact? Like, was this consideration of the securities ever at all in your research, ever at all a consideration in how that legislation in particular was developed?
Yeah, it's land title is always a consideration. So it's even someone like Ludlow, whom Ludlow Hall used to be named after, and his involvement in some companies like the New England Company, which actually, so PEI, I'll just give you the example here really quickly, because the government didn't own the land in fee simple title, investors like this New England company that was trying to buy a reserve, Lennox Island, for the Mi'kmaq with the explicit purpose of holding the land title. So there's all these different ways in which it's really the security of the land title that's the important part. So when the Indian Act or any sort of legislation that starts to describe a government holding the land title and that title being secured by something, then it makes the credit, it's a better investment, I guess. So for example, the New England Company was going to buy Lennox Island, and they eventually didn't because there was no security on the land title in the same way like New Brunswick had, for example, where you kind of understood that the land was backed by a government in a way that it wasn't in Prince Edward Island. So it absolutely has something to do with it, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. That was really good. And actually, the parallels between New Brunswick and Upper Canada at that time too are very fascinating, as are the differences, right? So there's many differences in how those two colonies are run that I think are really fruitful to look into as well. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Just looking to see if anybody's switching their mic on. I think everybody's. Oh, here we go. Heather has another question. Go ahead, Heather.
I'm just wondering, is this a book project that you're working on? And
yes.
When can we have it for classes to teach?
Let's hope like in a few years.
Okay. So
yeah, I'm new here. I just started last in July, so I'm new, and it's okay. We moved here, but yeah, it is. I'm trying to get the manuscript done, but it's taking a really long time, as you can imagine. But luckily, the Hudson's Bay Company actually has their archives online now, and I can go to PEI from here. But so I can kind of look into this and like use that in a way, but the pandemic, of course, especially if you're a historian, you use archives, has just been brutal for research. And yeah, as everybody probably knows already, you don't need me telling them, but yeah.
Well, it's please make sure that because it's just such a great project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you so much, Angela, for this talk. I think it's as I said, like fundamental research for especially talking about decolonization and the history of colonization and settler colonialism. I think it'll have great effects, especially for explaining how the processes have worked. So this is not the final talk, although it was an amazing one. We will be having one more talk in 2 weeks from now on March 31st by Debbie Von Huvenard, who will be talking about learning to be old, ageism, and sexism in everyday life. So please join us on March 31st for that talk. It's going to be the last talk of our Feminist Lunch series for winter 2021. And the series was sponsored by the Gender and Women's Studies program here at UNB, the UNB Faculty of Arts, and the STU UNB University Women's Center. We hope to see you all next week, and we wish you all a great week. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Fascinating.